Hello everyone and welcome to the next episode of Home of Houseplants. Today I have my very first international guest. I'm very excited to welcome Jane Perrone to Home of Houseplants, the podcast. Some of you may know Jane. She's a freelance journalist and presenter and producer of indoor gardening podcast On the Ledge. And if you haven't heard about this indoor plant podcast, you are very much missing out on some wonderful content. Jane, you are a freelance journalist, as I understand it, and apart from running On the Ledge, you write for a number of magazines, including, publications, I should say, The Guardian, The Financial Times, amongst others. Jane Perrone, welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to talk to you.
Jane, it's been a few weeks in the making, but we've finally been able to connect with each other. It's very early in the morning for you and it's well and truly dark outside for me. It's a real honour to have you join us today. I am a subscriber and fan of On the Ledge, and I should start off by saying a heartfelt congratulations to you on reaching 100 episodes.
Thank you. I'm still in shock, really, that I've managed to keep it going this long. But yeah, it was really nice to reach that goal, and also to hear from lots of listeners about how the show has helped them in lots of different ways. That was really lovely and has spurred me on to keep going. And actually, it was never really any doubt because I just love making this podcast. So it's a labour of love, but it's a wonderful thing to do. So I'm just looking forward to the next 100 now.
For those who don't know, and they will know at the end of this podcast episode, Jane has covered some amazing topics. I'm looking here at Houseplants for Low Light, an interview with Hilton Carter, who's a very now well-known author of an indoor plant book and stylist indeed. I'm looking at episodes, Jane, of Conservatory Love with Ruth Kassinger, Growing Hoyas, also known as the wax plant, Botanical Latin Explained. You really do cover every sort of aspect of the indoor plant hobby. You know, Jane, it's a lot of work as well. If I can take you back to the beginning of the year in 2017, so about January, I believe.
Yeah, I sort of started work on it in January 2017. The first episode came out at the end of February 2017.
Can you take us back to that time? And it wasn't that long ago when you made the decision to start On the Ledge. Can you tell us what was going through your mind and why indoor plants?
Well, back in the midst of time. Well, I had done a podcast with The Guardian when I was working at The Guardian a couple of years prior to that. And I'd got into podcasts like so many people when the podcast Serial came out, which is an American podcast about a murder. And I was not at all into true crime, but that podcast really gripped me and got me into podcasting big time. And I was listening to loads of podcasts. And I managed to convince The Guardian to do a gardening podcast with my colleague and friend Alice Fowler, which was wonderful. And people still say, oh, when's it coming back? It was called Sow, Grow, Repeat. Yep. And that was a gardening podcast generally. We covered indoor and outdoor. It was wonderful. I loved doing it. But ultimately, The Guardian had, I think basically The Guardian had lots of different irons in different fires when it came to podcasts, and they just wanted to narrow down their scope. So they didn't want to make any more of Sow, Grow, Repeat. And I was kind of left bereft at that point. So in January, February 2017, I was still working at The Guardian, and I just wanted to start a podcast. But I was worried because although I'd done another podcast, I didn't have to edit or produce that one because obviously that was done in-house at The Guardian. And so I didn't really know anything about editing or producing a podcast. I knew how to talk on the radio, but I didn't know that technical side of things. So I kind of just started asking around. In fact, a key person that gave me a kick up the backside and made me do it was a guy called Peter Donegan, who makes a podcast called The Sod Show in Ireland, which is a gardening podcast. And he just said, just do it, just try and see what happens. So I kind of set myself up and
went out and bought the equipment.
Bought a really cheap microphone and set myself up in the room I'm speaking to you in now, actually, my bedroom, with my laptop in the sock drawer. Because there was nowhere else to put it, and so I started off with very basic stuff, and I learned through Googling stuff, looking on Facebook groups for podcasters, asking for advice. And, it's not that hard. There's just a lot of different things you need to know. And, the beginning, using my editing software, I'd be like, okay, I don't know what's that button for? And I would just look on YouTube and there'll be a YouTube tutorial explaining how X, Y, or Z worked. So it was very rough and ready at the start. And I think it actually probably still is. The nature of making a weekly podcast is, you've got to get those episodes out. So on my podcast is not like, you get podcasts where it's kind of very carefully curated seasons of 6 episodes, beautifully formed, 1 season a year. That's not my podcast. It's a weekly show. No. So there are going to be, there are going to be imperfections in there. But at the same time, one of the things that was drummed into me when I started was, if you really want to make a success of this, you need to make a weekly show. And that was so in my mind as I started that I've just kind of been obsessed with that from the start. So I've really
Jane,
gone for it.
Why was that? This advice was from a fellow journalist, I presume. Was that?
Yeah, it was from somebody who helped me out at the start. She kind of did a bit of consultancy work for me in terms of helping me visualize what the podcast was going to be and so on. And she said to me, look, if you really want to make a success of this, ultimately want to make money out of it, which obviously I need to do, because this is taking me a day a week. I need to make that make some money out of it, cover my time eventually. And then a weekly show is how you build your audience. So, I do take breaks during the summer holidays and at Christmas, but at the same time, I've tried as much as possible to stick to weekly, because that seems to work for me and makes the show a regular thing. And now that I have got advertising on most episodes, obviously, you set up those deals and make sure that you deliver the podcast when you say you're going to deliver it. So that's been my experience. So I started out back in February 2017, and I really didn't know what I was doing in many ways, but I just blundered ahead, and I was lucky in that I managed to get great people to talk to from the start. So one of my early episodes, I interviewed Bob Flowerdew, who's a famous British gardener. And so I just kind of started going, and immediately, I'm lucky because as a journalist in the gardening field already, I had great contacts, so I could get people like Alice Fowler and to come on the show. And also get exposure from the show. And I did get exposure from The Guardian as well. I left The Guardian in July of that year to go freelance. And that was a bit scary. But I knew that I wanted to sort of change my horizons, and the podcast was part of that. So it's grown since there. And I suppose one of the things that's happened is my voice has developed as I've gone along. So one of the things that people sort of say to me is, do you script it all out? Do you have it all written out? And when I first started, I did. And you can probably, if you go back and listen to the very early episodes, you can probably hear that. But people are quite shocked when I tell them that nothing, and I mean literally nothing, is scripted out now.
Jane, were you in the earlier podcast, because I have been binging on the more recent ones in particular. I'd actually select episodes by virtue of the subject matter.
Yes.
But going back to those very early days, were there nerves, and was there sort of self-criticism that impinged upon how quickly you could turn episodes out? I'm just wondering.
Well, when you're making a weekly show, you cannot be too precious, right? It may not be perfect, but hey, it's 5:00 on a Friday. I've got to get this episode out. So you kind of that in a way is good, because one of the major issues with podcasting is people, as we'd say here in the UK, fanny around and say, it's not perfect. I can't put it out until it's perfect, and then they end up not making a show because they're so obsessed with. Obviously, you want to achieve the highest possible quality you can, but at the same time, if you're making a weekly show, it's like making, putting out a weekly magazine. You get to the point where you say, okay, we've got to go to press, so you do the best you can in the time that you've got, and hopefully listeners realise that you're making a weekly show, and therefore it's not going to be it's not going to be a David Attenborough documentary type approach.
No.
But what I do when I'm now is, which is why it probably makes editing the show a bit of a nightmare. I don't exactly speak off the cuff, and I do have points that I want to say, but I kind of record it kind of sentence by sentence, think about what I want to say, and then record a sentence. That might probably sound nuts, okay. But it makes it sound natural in a way that it's very hard to achieve if you're reading from a script. Very few people can read from a script in a way that doesn't make it sound very unnatural. So
yes,
that's
and
the way
wouldn't.
I do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Jane, take us through a typical week, in particular those early days, because I'd love to consider myself 2 years ago. I'm only up to episode 12, and unlike you, I'm actually only at the stage where I can really just produce or publish one episode a month. I'm sort of starting off at that point, and I hope to increase my rate of uploading episodes in the near future. But I am juggling a number of balls, as you are. But in those early days, Jane, is it 2 days a week where you presumably need to start off with what subject you're going to discuss that week, and perhaps you plan out 4 to 6 episodes ahead? And I'm sure you need to do that, because locating guests and locking them down for specific times to record the podcast is sort of one of the early steps you need to take, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
and then let alone record the episode.
I've always got a few sort of episodes in my mind being worked on, either literally being worked on or being worked on in my head, and setting up guests for that. It's a real juggle, and sometimes I don't. Like, sometimes at the start of the week I will not have any kind of episode planned out, which is a bit scary.
Right.
But you work something out. That's, I guess, thing is, I've been a journalist for many years. I don't know how long, many years, well over 20 years. And so for me, that kind of, the equivalent is, I'm putting out a weekly, when I used to work in local papers, putting out a weekly paper, I've got nothing here. I've got no front page. I've got no, and that's on the Monday, and you're going to press on the Thursday. So you've got to hustle. You've got to work something out. And the joy of Houseplants is, because it's not like waiting for some news to happen, there's always something to say. So even if it's an episode, I have done episodes where it's just me talking.
Yep.
And for some unknown reason, people like that as well. So I'm very lucky in that I can kind of, I can mix it up. I have done quite a lot of interview episodes recently, which tend to be the easiest, but I don't want every episode to just be an interview, because sometimes I think the subject matter requires a different approach.
Absolutely, Jane. And again, while I was preparing for this episode earlier today, I was having a look at your extensive show notes. So this is another area where I'm falling foul of the appropriate standards for podcasting. Not only do you record fabulous episodes, but you do some fantastic episode notes, or show notes sometimes, I think American podcasters call them, where you sort of summarise what's been discussed. And in particular, I was very keen to find out what houseplants live in Jane Perrone's house. And I went to the 2 episodes that you recorded. I think it was episode 38, Jane, and episode 69. And you've, dot pointed beautifully the genus and species names of the plants that you collect. And you've also uploaded a number of photos. And, it's a varied range of houseplants. But surely those show notes also take some time, Jane. So it's many facets to producing each episode. Would that be fair?
Yeah, it is. I mean, Fridays in our house, my husband always is like, oh God, it's Friday, because that's the day my podcast goes out. And, like oftentimes I'm finding myself, doing the show notes. I try to do them as I go, but that doesn't really work, and I end up doing them last. And then even once the podcast's out, then it's got to be put on Facebook, it's got to be put on Instagram, it's got to be tweeted about. I've got tweets to do for advertisers if I'm sponsored that week. So there's a lot to it. Yeah, I mean, I am now I'm further down the line. I do some weeks I have a guy called Joff Elphick who makes a podcast called Pot and Cloche himself, and also edits other people's podcasts, some weeks he will do a big tranche of the editing for me. And I also now have an admin person who works for me 4 days a week, because the amount of correspondence and keeping on top of things that I need to do has gone up exponentially. So Kelly Westlake, is brilliant as a wonderful assistant, and she does things like responding to emails and things like that. So I do now have some help, which I've been able to do because I've got some income coming in from the show. So that's really, really handy. But it's still a lot of work. Yeah. People sort of say, oh, I'm thinking of starting a gardening podcast. And you sort of say, okay, how much time have you got? Because it's, it's a lot of work that people don't realise. But the more you go along, the quicker you get at doing things. And as I say, I'm lucky because as a journalist, taking information and filtering it through and narrowing it down and making it clear is that's just me breathing, doing that. That is a massive advantage. I don't have to struggle over that kind of thing. So that's a big plus. But none of the things of podcasting are particularly hard. There's just a lot of it to do, and
absolutely
building that audience is really time consuming too. I go on Twitter and respond to individual tweets about houseplants and building an audience one tweet at a time, which sounds ridiculous, but actually that's how you get people on board. And if you get somebody who loves your show and then starts binging on it and tells 10 friends, then that's a win.
Well, Jane, another arrow to your bow or feather to your quill, whatever the expression is, where you do have people who ask you questions, and at times you also reply to them on the podcast. But as you said, it would be via Facebook Messenger or Instagram messages or what have you, and that's the investment you make in building your audience. So I quite agree. It's interesting though, Jane, as well. One of my my two favourite episodes, just because it's an insight into a world we in Australia sort of don't easily get to experience. But when you travelled to the Netherlands, I think that was a couple of months ago now, and you recorded whilst you were there, walking around, and what you were seeing and some of the cutting edge developments in terms of what the suppliers in the Netherlands were about to produce or about to release onto the European market. Is that a crossover in that sense? Because I presume you were there also perhaps for your work at The Guardian and presenting articles for publication. There would be the opportunity to blur the lines between the two?
Yes. In that trip was, and I did make this clear because I tried to be as transparent as possible about what I'm doing. So that trip was, I was a guest of something called The Joy of Plants, which is the UK arm of Flora Holland, which is an organisation in the Netherlands which promotes their houseplant trade basically and their plant trade more generally. So they flew me over there. So they paid for my hotel and my flight over there. They didn't pay me any money. They didn't pay me any fee, but they did pay for my travel and accommodation. So that was a trip that I spent 2 days there, and my side of the bargain was that I made they made a video with me in it, which they then put out on their channels, which was me kind of wafting around greenhouses.
I did see that. I was quite envious.
Which is what they got out of it. What I got out of it was an incredible insight into the houseplant world there. And of course, that feeds in massively into other things that I'm doing, of course. And that's very true of a lot of trips I do. So, for example, I did an episode with a guy called Mike Clifford, which he's got this amazing collection of all kinds of tropical plants in his garden. And that trip was possible because I was doing a job for The Guardian, visiting a garden in that vicinity on the south coast. And so I combined visiting that garden, which I was going to go to anyway, with a trip to Mike Clifford and a trip to Double H Nurseries, which was an orchid supplier, which also featured in my Phalaenopsis episode. So if I'm going to be somewhere for work anyway, then I obviously take advantage of that and go and do some recording for On the Ledge if I can. So yeah, it's great. That's great because it all feeds into one another, and I wouldn't have been able to do that trip at the time and pay for it without having a work job set up anyway. So I just made it a 2-day trip. I spent a day doing my Guardian work, and then so it's great. I mean, what could be better than spending your time interviewing fascinating plant people? It's just such fun.
Jane,
when somebody's paying you for it.
You're a lady after my own. Yeah, you're a lady after my own heart. Being a plant tourist, I did take a trip earlier this year to Cairns, North Queensland in Australia with my family, and one stop every day was to relevant nurseries up there and growers, and I did record 2 episodes while I was up there. But yeah, if you can incorporate, recording a podcast and, looking at stunning plants, why not? Dream holiday for me.
Did your family, though, constantly go, not another garden?
Yes. I had to. The deal was that there was 2 hours of plant shopping and 3 hours of swimming every day. So, it's always deal making in this house, Jane. It's
that's how you've got. I mean, people sort of say, "Oh, is your husband into plants?" And the answer is no, not in the slightest. And I'm not into gardening at all. And sometimes people say, "Oh, is that hard?" And it's like, no, because if he was, then we'd be constantly arguing about what we were doing, and it would feel like too many cooks spoil the broth. So he just tolerates it, and he doesn't notice when a new plant arrives. He might go,
bonus.
Is that new? Oh no, dear, it's just been moved around.
Been there forever.
So you just that's fine, and he's pretty tolerant. But he's got his own. He follows a football team and stuff and all that. So he's got his own passions, and we kind of pursue them. And usually harmony reigns. But there's the occasional conflict, but about plants. But that's life, isn't it? That's married life.
If anyone can't tell, I think they need to get their hearing checked. But Jane is from the UK, and Jane, obviously, houseplants, is the demand for them, is the interest in them going crazy over there just as much as it is here in Australia? I know you did interview an Australian guest a couple of months ago from Perth, and he gave you some insight into what's going on over here. But my goodness, Jane, you can't keep up with demand.
Yes. It is the same here. I mean, it's been interesting. I was looking back on my blog, and I wrote a post in 2012 bemoaning the fact that lots of garden centres were getting rid of their houseplant collections. And then I think somewhere between 2012 and 2017, the change gradually happened where there was just this intense spike of interest in houseplants, which is wonderful to see. And yes, it is, houseplants are now, cool clothing shops in London are full of houseplants, and places where you just wouldn't see them. And young people, arguing about, aroid fenestration, like how did the hell did this happen?
And there's very much a status for certain sectors of the enthusiast category. There's almost a status symbol or positioning, wealth positioning as well. That's a slice of the overall category of people who, look, I've got a variegated monstera. They're huge over here, by the way, Jane. I'm sure you're aware of that. A variegated monstera, up until recently, the prices have dropped somewhat, but you're looking at $1,200, if not more. Wow. It's crazy stuff.
Let me ask you a question. Because I'm thinking of the Thailand is huge for that kind of stuff in terms of producing that kind of stuff. I guess you're a bit closer to Thailand than us. Do you find that the flow of plants into your country is plants are accessible, or are there lots of things that you can see and hear are available in the UK and the US that you can't get hold of?
Yes, it's the latter, Jane. Despite being very close to Thailand, super strict quarantine laws prohibit entry of anything. And for, in particular, aroids, Jane, I had a guest last episode who was an aroid importer in the 80s and early 90s. He gave up because aroids have to, in particular, be treated with now, methyl bromide, it's an insidious gas that I believe he said in the podcast that in nowhere else in the world is it used except in Australian quarantine purposes to fumigate plants. And most plants don't survive the treatment, Jane, and there have been a number of cases where people have invested a small fortune to bring plants in from Thailand that I'm anecdotally aware of, and they have been killed by quarantine treatment, and there is a very good reason for that, Jane. We don't have a lot of the diseases and pests that other countries do have, but to bring anything into Australia would require heavy treatment in terms of chemical and gas use, and then on top of that, Jane, that needs to demonstrate 3 months of good growth. So if you have perhaps a cutting that's starting to sprout, or that a plant does survive the treatment and starts to sprout but doesn't demonstrate consistent growth for 3 months, you have to leave it there until it does at your own at your expense as well, and that can lead to many thousands of dollars.
Wow.
Yeah,
well, that's crazy. Well, there you go. Well, I mean, I knew that was the case. I knew some of that, but that's really interesting to hear. Well, I mean, I feel slightly embarrassed to say that I have 3 variegated monsters.
Oh,
But
Jane, you're showing off now.
I know, I'm showing off. Well, 2 of them I got kind of accidentally. And there's a company in this country called the Tropical Plant Company, and at the time they seemed to be operating mainly through Facebook. And it was one of those sort of weird things where this post popped up saying, variegated monstera seedlings, and I put in an order and it never turned up, and then I sort of realised a few weeks later nothing has happened, and I emailed them and they said, oh, we're really sorry, it's our mistake, we'll send you 2. So instead of getting 1 I got 2. So those are my 2
Jane.
big plants, and then I've got, somebody gave me another one which they couldn't look after anymore, which is a much smaller one, but one of my big ones has had a bit of a problem. I basically desperately needed repotting, and one of the new leaves has kind of suffered because it was so desperate for nutrients, because I've had such a busy time this spring. My repotting has not been as quick as it should have been, so I've learnt my lesson there. They're really hungry plants and they need repotting, but you know what, one of the things that people often say, someone will email me, particularly people who are new to plants, and say, oh my God, something terrible's happened. And it's one leaf that's got some, like got a bit of a burn mark on it or something.
Yeah, or you've overwatered it.
If it's all the leaves, I've got an issue with it. But if it's one leaf, not every leaf is perfect. I think it's one of those things where Instagram gives people a false impression that all plants should look perfect, whereas actually, ultimately, you're going to have some damage to your houseplants. Not every leaf is going to look wonderful, and therefore you monitor it. If you've got some damage to one leaf and it starts spreading to other leaves, obviously then you get concerned. So this poor leaf now has come out, it's unfurled, and it's kind of, half of it is all kind of, I think it's got what's called necrosis, where it's kind of like dissolved away. But hey, the other side, now I've corrected the problem by repotting and supplying the nutrients, the other side of the leaf's fine. So ultimately that leaf is going to live its life, and then it's going to live its best life, and ultimately it will yellow and die at some point as the plant grows. So hey, it's but people get very, very bent out of shape about small things when they start out, and then you get the other extreme where this is a real thing here in the UK, which really annoys me sometimes, is you'll get somebody who email and say, what do I do about this plant? It's looking a bit poorly, and it's a stick in a pot, and you say, it's dead, compost it, don't bother trying to save that plant.
I know, and it's you do have to extend a degree of patience, and because not everyone is aware, are they? And you can take these things for granted when you come perhaps from a family background that were gardeners, and this innate knowledge that gets handed down as you spend your childhood helping mum and dad or grandparents in the garden. But not everyone has had that experience, have they? But you do have to, I certainly do have to keep myself in check sometimes.
Yes, and that's a major part of my job now is helping people out. So I always try to be respectful and recognise where that person's coming from in terms of what their attitude is to their plant, and therefore you kind of you feel your way and you try to offer useful advice, but sometimes it does make me smile when people just get very upset. But then sometimes it's totally correct for them to be getting terribly upset. Sometimes you get a picture and it's a calathea and it's covered in spider mite, and you just think, oh God, quick, put that plant somewhere quarantined and deal with it, because you've got a major problem there. So it's there's always something new. Lots of the questions have come in over and over again. I mean, the number of times I see a picture of a leggy etiolated succulent is not worth counting. But there's always some new and weird question coming in. So always makes it interesting.
Jane, funny you should mention that company that you bought the variegated monstera from. I think popped up on my Facebook feed, and I paid attention because I'm sure you are aware of the Aglaonema tricolour pictum, the camouflage plant.
Yep.
I think it was that company that about 2 months ago had about 15 for sale at a very reasonable price. Now, very recently in Australia, they have reached a huge... It's impossible to find, and if they are for sale, they're on eBay here. And we're talking small. I think you could buy a cheap second-hand car. Again, because we're so closed off from the rest of the world. Gosh, I should have done a completed listing search on eBay. I feel like reaching for my phone now, but I am sure that plant went for close to $2,000. I myself did have a sad story to tell about that one. I secured one about a year ago, the size of my thumb. I feel like saying thumbnail, but I'll be generous and say thumb. And I unwrapped it so carefully, and I believe I videotaped the unwrapping, and it was just intent on dying on me, Jane, and I did lose that one. That one cost me $300, which feels super cheap compared to what was recently sold for. So
you see,
I'm frightened away now.
I am such a skinflint. I just wouldn't pay that much for a plant.
Okay, that's making me feel worse. Thanks.
Sorry. I'm such a skinflint. I am very, very I love plants, but I just I wouldn't. That's a really interesting one. I mean, I'm trying to think what the most I've ever paid for a plant is. I would say it can't be over £20. Is that shocking?
Wow.
Because
I
prefer to buy I prefer to buy small plants. So if I find a plant that I really want that's small, I will buy it, but I will never buy a massive mature aroid, because for me part of the fun is getting it is watching it grow from that immature stage to the mature stage. And also I'm just a skinflint. I love propagating plants, and I guess that's the other thing is I love the swapping and bartering that goes on among houseplant people. So a lot of the kind of rarer plants I've got have been through wonderful swaps and generous listeners who've sent me stuff. I mean, when I did my episode on Pilea peperomioides, the Chinese money plant way back, that was when that plant was reaching ridiculous prices, and a lovely reader just sent me a baby, and so I was just so lucky in that respect. But I that's just me. I mean, I'm just trying to think if I ever have spent more than that. I don't think I have. And also the other thing is that I'm not a massive big plant person. I love gesneriads and things like that, and I don't tend to go for the massive plants. Obviously my monsteras will get really big, but my plan for those, the variegated ones, is as soon as I get one that is big enough, I'm going to start taking cuttings of it, and I'm going to basically not auction them off. I'm gonna do a listener giveaway for anyone in the UK and just give them away to listeners. So, but it's not quite there yet. But I don't need two. I don't really need three of them, quite frankly. So, as I say, once they get to that stage, that will happen, which will be fun. But I suspect it may raise the ire of my non-UK listeners who are like, no.
It will do. Jane, can I shock you a little more then? We had recently, and I'm wondering if you have it or you've come across it in the UK. It's the Monstera, and I'm going to pronounce it Adansonii.
Yeah.
Incorrectly referred to, and there's a lot of correction out there, but often incorrectly referred to as Monstera obliqua, but the correct name is Monstera Adansonii. About 2-3 months ago on eBay, there was a 1-leaf rooted cutting that sold for $5,500 Australian dollars.
Of just Adansonii.
There's silence now. A variegated one.
Oh, a variegated one. Oh, yeah.
Have you seen them in the UK?
US. I think there was one in the US that went for a similar sum. I mean, I just don't. I suppose it's rarity, isn't it? But I would.
It is.
You know what? I would. This is a controversial thing to say, possibly, but I would get just as much pleasure and joy out of seeing a beautiful, full, lush pothos as I would seeing a beautiful, full, lush Monstera Adansonii variegata or whatever it's called. And actually, I think I'm much more likely to have a healthy, lush pothos than I am that particular plant, which, as I understand it, is actually quite hard to grow. So I don't know. I guess it's the rarity value, and for me,
yes.
I guess I don't really care what other people think of the plants that I like. I mean, I said this in the 100th episode. I said, you like what you like. Don't feel pressured because you love moth orchids, and some people are a bit, funny about moth orchids because they're so common. Don't let that put you off. That's the thing you love. You love it. On you go. Enjoy it. don't feel like you've got to be pressurised to like the things that are trendy or the things that are in fashion. I love flowering houseplants, streptocarpus and things. And, you know, interestingly, I went to a presentation at the RHS a while back, and sales of streptocarpus have actually dropped, which amid a massive increase in houseplant popularity. I found that really annoying and and disappointing, but I'm not going to stop growing them because I love them. So that's my thing is, you know, if you really genuinely love something because you love it, not just because it's rare, then go for it and enjoy that plant. But I'm never going to be one of those people. I'm never going to be an early adopter of some rare houseplant. I'm going to go for it because I enjoy it. That said, the only thing that I probably would, if somebody offered me one now for £50, I would probably take, is there's a Sansevieria, which I'm always going on about on the show, called Bantel Sensation, which is really...
Oh, I have that. Yes, I have that, and I sell it.
Which is really, it's impossible to get here. So I'm
Right.
just, that's one plant that I would love to have. I don't know why I love it, but I really want to have that plant. But at the same time, you know, I'll live without it. And as I say, a lot of the plants that I have got that are special, like for example, I have a Maranta lemon lime, which is the Maranta with the pale green ribs rather than red ribs.
Yes.
That came from the lovely Tommy Tonsberg, who is a grower in Scandinavia, who brought it over to me when I met him at Chelsea. And again, I will bulk that up, and if I have divisions to give to people, I will give them away. But I wouldn't have paid a lot of money for that plant, but I was happy to have that offered to me. I mean, I have done a few crazy things. I did, quite early on when the podcast started, I did make a massive plant order to a plant company, mail order plant company in the Czech Republic. And it didn't come for months, and it was and it cost me a fortune in shipping.
Oh my goodness!
But that was probably my most extravagant purchase. But again, it was all tiny plants that individually didn't cost a huge amount of money, but I did get some rarities in there. So
Jane, can you tell me, you know, from a layman's perspective, because you're certainly not an expert, nor that I expect you to, but the quarantine laws in the UK, obviously plants are coming in daily from the Netherlands. Are there any restrictions at all on importation of plants in the UK?
Well, right now, given that we're still part of the European Union as we speak, touching a nerve there, but now while we're in Europe, the restrictions on plants moving from one European country to another are, in terms of trade, very, very limited. You know, they're nothing like what you're facing in terms of bringing in plants from overseas. Obviously, if you there is monitoring and everything, and you need to have all the paperwork, but it's not a difficult process. If you can bring plants back from overseas. However, there is a big campaign running right now about not bringing plants back from holidays overseas, because there are so many pests and diseases being brought in that are causing problems to our plants, and new diseases popping up. So I think they're discouraging people from, you know, just putting a plant in their suitcase anymore, because things like phytophthora and things are diseases that are coming into the UK. Ash dieback, which is a condition that affects ash trees, that was brought in through trees being grown in European nurseries. I mean, why on earth we were growing ash trees anywhere other than our own country where they grow perfectly well, I don't know. But anyway, so that's becoming more of an issue. And when we leave the EU, if we ever leave the EU, who knows? Yes. But assuming we leave, then I think that will have a huge impact on, it could be very serious for the houseplant industry, because there's going to be a lot more checks and time-consuming border crossings for companies bringing plants into the UK. So I think we could see houseplant prices go up, and things becoming less available.
So, but beforehand, you could legally perhaps go to Bali, pick some plant, you know, or Thailand, and take some cuttings and bring them in.
That applies within Europe. Outside Europe,
right?
No, you wouldn't be able to do that. I think outside Europe, Again, I would have to check, but I think you can bring a limited number of seed packets back, but I don't think I think you can bring plants back, but you have to have a phytosanitary certificate and fulfill all of those requirements. The reason I know that is because when I interviewed a guy called Jamie Song, who has a very legendary Instagram called Jamie's Jungle here in the UK,
yes,
he got his mum, who is from Taiwan, to bring exactly the Chinese evergreen you're talking about back to the UK, and she got the phytosanitary certificate and did all of that stuff to get it back properly. So you can do it, but you have to fill out a lot of paperwork, which obviously most kind of people kind of doing it on impulse don't want to do. But you can do it, but there are much more restrictions outside Europe.
But then provided you have the phytosanitary certificate and any necessary paperwork, there's certainly no withholding period, as we do have here in Australia, where
I don't think so.
Taken from you
and sit there for 3 months, sitting there. I think provided it's been treated in the correct way and has the paperwork and they're happy with it, it can come through. But, I always, say to people, think carefully about, what you're bringing back and don't, follow the rules, because the rules are there for a really good reason. Obviously, I think Australia's history of problems with non-native species has made the Australian authorities, rightly or wrongly, very cautious.
Yes.
It's understandable, I guess. And it was interesting when I was talking to Dan Torre, who wrote the book on cactus. I can't remember which episode that was, and he lives in somewhere in Australia. I'm now forgetting where. And he was saying about how lots of cacti were banned completely for many years because of problems with invasions of cacti taking over land and wiping out native plants.
Yes, in particular, I think he was referring to the prickly pear, which can't even be moved across state borders. It's been declared a weed. It's just interesting to hear what's happening in terms of quarantine in the UK. But that's fascinating, because you certainly get the impression when you see some of the amazing plants that can be moved around the EU that you kind of have slum envy. But things do sound like they're going to change for you guys over there. But
we'll
Jane,
see. We'll see.
We'll see. Jane, do you find yourself evolving in terms of your plant collection? My heart lies with aroids, but I do adore. I've discovered Sansevieria, and I do have the whale fin Sansevieria, the Masoniana. Which is a stunning broadleaf blade, or often referred to, I think, as the propeller plant. Often, but I like the common name, the whale fin plant. I have Bantel Sensation, but I'm also discovering the very limited range of jewel orchids, because they're all about the foliage, Jane. And they're stunning. It's almost like lightning bolts across the green version. I think it's pronounced Macodes petala. Stunning. It's iridescent lightning bolts. Do you find yourself evolving into different areas?
Well, lots of my listeners complain and say, Jane, you're costing me so much money, because at the end of every episode they have a new list of plants they hadn't even thought of before that they desperately must have. And I say, you know what, it's exactly the same for me. And it does happen. I've been going through a period of, well, right now, actually, I'm going through a period of really assessing my houseplants, because this spring has been really, really crazily busy. It's ridiculously. And I have to say, some of my houseplants have suffered because I've got so many houseplants and so little time. So I'm really having a really good sort out at the moment. And some things are going that I just think it's not, this plant is not happy with me. I know I can grow decent ferns if I put the time into it, but a lot of my ferns that I've had over the years, I just think I cannot devote the time that you need. I don't have many ferns anymore, and other plants that have just proven not suited to me personally, I have either given away or have ended up on the compost heap, and that's fine, that's okay. I've realised that Begonia Rex are never going to be happy with me. At some point in time I may come back to them and with a different house and different circumstances, but right now that's just going to be a road washed with tears. So, you have to adapt. And I'm, going through my houseplants right now, and I'm putting aside plants that are going to be given away, or that I'm going to take cuttings of and make young plants, and then get rid of the old plants. I try to be quite unsentimental because A, I've got so many plants, and B, I've got people and dogs that need attention, so I can't be too precious about anything. And it's a warning sign. If I see a plant and think, oh gosh, I've really let that go, then to me that's saying you don't love that enough to really take care of it, therefore it's probably not the right plant for you. So plants that I'm trying to really take good care of, I try to put somewhere where I see them really regularly, and I've been doing a lot of things to try to make my life easier. So I've got plants that they're in individual pots, but they're in a trough which is filled with hydrolica, which is the expanded clay pellets, and so I can just give them a really good water, and any overspill of water goes into the pellets in the trough and sits there, and they can absorb that back up. So trying to make my life easier and using self-watering pots and things has helped. But I still need to get rid of more plants, quite frankly, and it's constantly fluctuating. I mean, another thing I got was a load of Hoya cuttings from this guy Tommy Tonsberg. And again, I'm letting those grow, and then I'm going to make a decision about which ones I keep, because I do not have room for all these Hoyas. So
no.
Listeners maybe
you need to re-listen
giveaways along the way.
Yes. I
love Hoyas though. I adore Hoyas. They're so fabulous, but I don't have room for 12 different species of Hoya.
No, it sounds like you're very acutely aware of that, particularly after doing the episode on plant hoarding, and the guests that you spoke to for that episode. That was really interesting to listen to. I loved that one as well. Jane, I'm cognizant of your precious time, and I wanted to ask you a bit of a selfish question towards the end of this episode in terms of what's the future for the podcast. In particular, I wanted to ask you, given indoor plants are such a visual medium, do you feel the pressure to start uploading video content, in particular to your YouTube channel? I know you very generously share your episodes on YouTube, and I certainly feel that pressure in terms of having a video medium, but it's just a matter of managing my time and what I can do. I'm interested to know your thoughts, and is that something you're going to expand into in the future?
Really good question. Well, yes, I mean, people often say that to me, oh yeah, you should do videos, and in that kind of offhand way, as if it's really easy. But you know what, I'm sure for this sort of younger generation who have grown up with phones with cameras, it's all very easy. But I mean, I can do it, but it just is incredibly time consuming, and I don't have the time to do it right now. At some point I may, but it's not something that I have thought that I should dedicate the time to right now, because building a YouTube channel into a successful channel takes a lot of time. So
absolutely.
And I think one of the joys of the podcast is that you can take it along with you, whatever you're doing. Like, I listen to a lot of podcasts while I'm walking the dog, and although obviously, as you say, plants are very visual, I think people appreciate the fact that they can kind of just switch off their eyes and listen and get something out of it that way. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to do video, but again, I'd love to write a book. I'd love to write, X, Y, and Z. I mean, there's one or two things in the pipeline which I can't really talk about now, but there's one or two things in the pipeline that make me think that probably I won't be dedicating a hell of a lot of time to video in the near future.
Okay.
But you know what? Who knows? I'd love to do a YouTube channel about composting. That's another thing I would just love to do because I've not seen any good YouTube channels about composting. I'd love to do a whole series of videos on that, but I think if I did, I'd probably get somebody to help me doing the actual videoing, because you know what, it's really hard to do it all yourself. So I admire all these YouTubers who manage to do it, but I've had one very steep learning curve with the podcast, and I'm not sure I'm ready for another one quite yet.
Jane, I from my perspective, as you know, I've got children like yourself and young children, most of the time I'm lucky to be able to pull my hair back into a bun and put on a t-shirt and some jeans with dirt under my fingernails and madly doing the school run, and I just don't feel like the world is ready to see that, and the amount of preparation I personally would feel I would need to put into myself to be able to do a visual medium is just so beyond my ability at this point in time that as I sit here recording this, I can sort of sit in my dressing gown and kick the shoes off, and that's the great thing about the podcast.
Exactly. I mean, I do. The only thing I do is I do when I have time, I do some Instagram stories, which occasionally shows my face, but oftentimes is just me showing something, and I will do that, and that I kind of like doing. And on my Instagram, some of those are saved in those kind of like circles at the top, so you can go and look at me doing cuttings or something. And I don't mind that.
You did a live, didn't you, Jane? There was an was there a Facebook live you did a while?
Yeah, I've done the Facebook live thing. So I do those kind of things, but it's not my core thing to do, because it's just not something that, as I say, it's a lot of time, and life is hard, right? I've got to make money. And so how I make money is I do make some money from the podcast, of course, but I'm sure people sort of say, oh gosh, you must be raking it in. But then you kind of look at, okay, I make 4 episodes a month. This is how much I'm making a month from Patreon and from advertising. Even now, it's not a great deal of money given the amount of time I put into it. So I have to do work for other organisations so that on the other days of the week, so that I can actually pay my bills. So I don't feel bad about it. But, I think it would be fun was the main reason to do YouTube. I think it would be enormous fun. But, I think I would need somebody on hand to do all the technical side of things, so it wasn't too painful. Jane,
can you let everyone know how they can find you and where they can find On the Ledge podcast? Because I think if you're not subscribing, you're missing out. And if once you do, you just listen to one, it'll keep you busy for days. Honestly, the subject matter you discuss.
So you can find everything about me at janeperrone.com. And if you search on any pod app, you should be able to find On the Ledge there. It's also on Spotify. It's also on YouTube. And you can. I do write blog posts as well. Not as often as I should. Is another thing I should spend more time on. But janeperrone.com is the place to start. And from there you can go to all the major pod apps and sign up, and you can read more about me and so on and so forth. And and I'm on Twitter as @Jane Perrone, and I'm on Instagram as j.l.perrone. Annoyingly, the Jane Perrone handle was already taken on Instagram by somebody else called Jane Perrone.
How disappointing.
I know, and I have sort of thought about emailing her and say, how much at Jane Perrone, but I think that would be a little bit sad. But I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and you can find. We also have a really lovely Facebook group called Houseplant Fans of On the Ledge, which is if you kind of are a member of other houseplant Facebook groups which get a bit annoying and full of drama and people arguing.
Yes.
Join Houseplant Fans of On the Ledge, because it is a no drama group. Everybody is respectful. Everybody is nice. And let me tell you, that is a rarity on Facebook.
It sure is, and I can attest to that, because I have been permitted entry into that group after answering 2 brief questions, and it's a lovely, lovely group, and absolutely there's no drama. And if you are a die-hard fan, you can even buy merchandise.
You can buy merchandise.
Which I think is fabulous. I love it. And support Jane via Patreon, because it's not easy, Jane, with all the costs and setting it all up. And I think that's I think it's leading the gardening world down that path, because other categories of, I'm going to say, hobbies or areas of interest do this, and they're well advanced of the gardening community. And I think it's about time, the gardening world got onto that level of support, because without it, you can't do it. So, I think it's great, Jane.
Thank you.
Jane, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Jane. I could chat to you for hours, but you've got gardening to do and podcasts to plan. So I will let you go, but and I really am grateful for your time, and happy gardening.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Jane.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Home of Houseplants. I really do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I would love for you to subscribe and leave a review, as it does help many others find the podcast, and in particular those that share the passion, the obsession that is growing indoor plants. I would like to give a shout out to Music Bed for the fabulous cool beats that you've heard during the course of this podcast and throughout the episodes. Home of Houseplants has a licensing agreement with musicbed.com to support the artists, both emerging and established. If you do wish to contact me, please do so via Instagram at Home of Houseplants or via my email address, which you can easily find on the website, homeofhouseplants.com.au. Please enjoy the week, the day, your evening, whatever time you are listening to this podcast, and I look forward for you to join me on the next episode, whenever that will be in the future. Bye, guys.